The autumn rain pattered against the windows of Rosewood Cafe, creating a soothing rhythm that Emma Parker had grown to appreciate during her 6 months working there. At 16, she was the youngest employee, having convinced Mr. Jenkins, the owner, to hire her despite her age. Necessity had made her surprisingly persuasive. "Order up for table 7, called Marge from behind the counter, her voice cutting through the gentle murmur of the morning crowd. Emma tucked a strand of her chestnut hair behind her ear and balanced the tray of steaming coffee cups with practiced precision. 6 months had turned her into an expert at navigating the narrow spaces between tables without spilling a drop. Every tip counted when your mother's medical bills kept piling up. "Here you go, sir. 2 black coffees and a blueberry muffin," she said, setting down the items at a table occupied by regulars, 2 accountants from the firm across the street who never varied their order. The bell above the door chimed, but Emma didn't look up immediately. The morning rush was in full swing, and she had 3 more orders to deliver. It wasn't until she heard Marge's surprisingly formal tone that she glanced toward the entrance. "Mr. Blackwood, what a surprise to see you in person, sir." The cafe seemed to hush as a tall man in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit stepped inside, removing sunglasses despite the grey day outside. Alexander Blackwood, CEO of Blackwood Enterprises, whose office tower dominated the downtown skyline. Everyone in town knew who he was, though few had seen him in person. Usually it was his assistant, a perpetually harried woman named Ms. Reynolds, who collected his coffee order. Emma had never understood why someone would send an assistant for coffee when the cafe was just a block from the Blackwood building, but such were the mysteries of the ultra-wealthy. "Ms. Reynolds is out sick today," he explained, his voice deep and measured. "Thought I'd get my own coffee for once." Emma watched him from the corner of her eye as she delivered her remaining orders. There was something magnetic about his presence, not just the obvious power and wealth, but a certain gravity that seemed to pull everyone's attention toward him. "Your usual, sir?" Marge asked, already preparing the cup. "Please," he replied, reaching into his pocket for his wallet. Emma turned away, focusing on wiping down a recently vacated table. Her mother's hospital appointment was tomorrow, and she was still short on this month's payment. The doctor had been understanding so far, but patience had limits, especially when it came to the experimental treatment that was her mother's best hope. As she cleared dishes, a wallet fell to the floor behind her with a soft thud. She turned to see Mr. Blackwood bending to retrieve it, several business cards spilling out onto the hardwood floor. "Let me help you, sir," Emma said, kneeling to gather the scattered cards. "Thank you," he said, his voice softer than when addressing Marge. As Emma handed him the last card, something caught her eye. A small photograph had fallen out as well, landing face up on the floor between them. The woman in the picture had the same chestnut hair as Emma, the same gentle curve to her smile. But it was impossible. There was no way this man could have... "Sir?" Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper as she picked up the photograph with trembling fingers. "Why is my mother's picture in your wallet?" Alexander Blackwood's face drained of color as he looked from the photograph to Emma's face. The resemblance was unmistakable, the same warm brown eyes, the same delicate features. For perhaps the first time in his meticulously controlled life, he appeared completely lost for words. "That's..." he began, then stopped, clearly struggling. "That's Catherine Parker?" Emma nodded slowly, her mind racing. "She's my mother. How do you have her picture?" The cafe had gone completely silent. Even Marge had stopped bustling behind the counter, frozen in the act of wiping down the espresso machine. The handful of customers seemed to collectively hold their breath. "I think we should talk," Alexander said finally, his composure returning, though his eyes remained fixed on Emma's face with an intensity that made her heart race. "Privately." "I'm working," Emma replied automatically, though her mind was screaming with questions. "I can't just leave." Mr. Jenkins appeared from the back room, apparently having overheard. "Take your break, Emma. Take as long as you need." Emma glanced between her boss and the billionaire, feeling as though she had stepped into someone else's life. "My mother never mentioned knowing you," she said, trying to make sense of the situation. "It was a long time ago," Alexander replied, his voice tight with something Emma couldn't quite identify. "Please, just a few minutes of your time." The rain had intensified outside, drumming against the cafe windows. Emma untied her apron with fingers that didn't feel like her own. Her entire life it had been just her and her mother against the world. Catherine Parker had raised her alone, working multiple jobs, never speaking about Emma's father except to say he wasn't in the picture. And now this man, this stranger who commanded empires, had her mother's photograph in his wallet. "There's a private dining room in the back," Emma suggested, unsure why she was even considering this conversation. But the photograph burning in her hand demanded answers. As Alexander Blackwood followed her to the back room, Emma felt the weight of every customer's curious gaze. Whatever was about to happen, she knew with absolute certainty that her life would never be the same. The photograph in her hand seemed to pulse with untold secrets, with years of silence and half-truths. And as she closed the door behind them, cutting off the murmurs from the cafe, Emma faced the billionaire with a question that might shatter her entire understanding of her life. "Who exactly are you to my mother?" Alexander Blackwood sat across from Emma in the small private dining room, his imposing stature somehow diminished by the vintage wooden chairs. Rain continued to drum against the window, filling the silence that stretched between them. He stared at Emma with an unnerving intensity. "I knew your mother at university," he finally said, his fingers tapping nervously on the table. "We were close." Emma clutched the photograph, still struggling to process this revelation. "Close? What does that mean exactly?" "We were together for almost 3 years, Alexander clarified, his gaze drifting to the photograph in Emma's hand. "Until circumstances forced us apart." "Circumstances?" Emma repeated, a strange pressure building in her chest. "What circumstances?" Alexander sighed, running a hand through his salt and pepper hair. "My father didn't approve. The Blackwoods had certain expectations, and Catherine, your mother, didn't fit into his vision for the family's future." Emma felt a surge of protective anger. "So you just left her because Daddy said so? What kind of man does that?" "A young, foolish one," Alexander admitted, no trace of defensiveness in his voice. "I was 22, set to inherit a company in crisis. My father made it clear, either I ended things with Catherine, or he would disown me and let the company collapse, putting thousands out of work." He paused, his eyes meeting Emma's. "I made a choice I've regretted every day since." "Why keep her picture all these years?" Emma asked, her voice softer now despite herself. "Because she was the only thing in my life that was ever real," he answered simply. After I ended things, I threw myself into saving the company. I succeeded beyond anyone's expectations, built it into something 10 times greater than what my father had. But nothing," his voice cracked slightly, "nothing has ever filled the void that leaving her created." Emma studied his face, searching for deception but finding only pain and something that looked unsettlingly like hope. "Does she know you're here? In this town, I mean?" Emma asked. Alexander shook his head. "I built the headquarters here 5 years ago when I learned she had settled here, but I've never approached her. I couldn't bring myself to disrupt her life again." A terrible suspicion began forming in Emma's mind. "When exactly did you and my mother separate?" 17 years ago this December," he answered. Emma calculated quickly. She was 16. The timing was suggestive. "Mr. Blackwood," she began carefully, "did my mother ever tell you she was pregnant?" The color drained from Alexander's face for the second time that morning. "What?" he whispered, his composed exterior crumbling entirely. "I'm 16, Emma said, watching his expression transform as the implications sank in. "She's never told me anything about my father except that he wasn't in the picture." Alexander stood abruptly, nearly knocking over his chair. "She never told me," he said, his voice hollow with shock. "I would have—" He stopped, visibly struggling to compose himself. "Emma, is your mother at home now? I need to speak with her." "She's in the hospital," Emma replied, immediately regretting how callously the words came out when she saw genuine fear flash across his face. "Hospital? What's wrong? Is she all right?" The questions tumbled out in rapid succession. "She has a rare form of lymphoma," Emma explained, the familiar weight of worry settling back on her shoulders. "The conventional treatments didn't work. She's on an experimental protocol now, but it's expensive. That's why I'm working here, despite being in high school." Alexander sat back down heavily. "How long has she been sick?" "Almost 2 years now," Emma said. "The new treatment is showing promise, but—" She trailed off, not wanting to articulate her constant fear. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" Alexander murmured, more to himself than to Emma. Then, with sudden resolve, he pulled out his phone. "I'm calling my assistant. I want her transferred to the Mayfield Clinic immediately. They have the best oncology department on the East Coast." "Wait," Emma protested, caught off guard by his decisive action. "You can't just take over like this. We don't even know if you're—" She couldn't bring herself to say the word father. Alexander paused, phone in hand. "You're right," he conceded, setting the phone down. "I'm overstepping. But Emma, if there's even a possibility that you're my daughter, and Catherine is ill, I want to help. Not to make up for the past, nothing could do that, but because it's the right thing to do." Emma felt torn between suspicion and desperate hope. The medical bills were crushing them, and her mother was getting weaker despite her brave smiles. "She might not want to see you," Emma warned. "She never talks about the past." "I understand," Alexander replied, "but will you at least tell her I'm here, that I want to help, that I never knew?" Emma studied him for a long moment. There was sincerity in his eyes that was difficult to dismiss, and yet, where had this sincerity been for 16 years? "I'll tell her," she finally agreed. "But I can't promise anything." Alexander nodded, relief visible on his face. "That's all I ask." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card, writing something on the back before sliding it across the table. "My personal number. Call me anytime, day or night." Emma took the card, staring at the elegant embossed lettering. Alexander Blackwood, CEO, Blackwood Enterprises. The man who might be her father. "I should get back to work," she said, suddenly overwhelmed by everything. "Of course." Alexander stood, straightening his jacket. "Emma, thank you for talking with me. Whatever happens next, I want you to know that meeting you today has been—" He searched for words. "The most important moment of my life." Emma didn't know how to respond to such a declaration, so she simply nodded and led the way back to the main cafe area. The curious stares of the customers followed them, but Emma barely noticed, her mind still reeling. As Alexander prepared to leave, he turned back to her. "I'll wait to hear from you," he said quietly. "But please know that whatever Catherine decides, I want to help with her medical expenses. No strings attached." Before Emma could respond, he was gone, disappearing into the rain-soaked street outside. She stood frozen by the door, the business card clutched in her hand, feeling as though the ground beneath her had shifted irrevocably. "Everything okay, honey?" Marge asked, concern evident in her voice. "I'm not sure," Emma answered truthfully. How could she explain what had just happened, when she herself couldn't fully comprehend it? As she tied her apron back on and returned to work, one thought kept circling through her mind. How was she going to tell her mother that Alexander Blackwood, the man she had never once mentioned in 16 years, was back in town and claiming he never knew he might have a daughter? The hospital visit scheduled for tomorrow now loomed with new significance. Emma would have to find the right words to upend her mother's carefully constructed world, just when Catherine needed stability most. But perhaps, just perhaps, this unexpected connection could be the miracle they had been praying for. The antiseptic smell of the hospital corridor made Emma's stomach twist as she approached her mother's room. She had barely slept, rehearsing different ways to broach the subject of Alexander Blackwood. The business card burned in her pocket like a live coal. "Hey, sweetheart." Catherine Parker greeted her daughter with a smile that belied her exhaustion. Despite the illness that had ravaged her body, Catherine retained an ethereal beauty, the same beauty captured in the photograph Emma had discovered yesterday. "Hi, Mum," Emma replied, setting down her backpack and arranging the fresh flowers she'd brought. "How are you feeling today?" "Better," Catherine said, though the dark circles under her eyes suggested otherwise. "Doctor, Meta says my numbers are improving. Slowly, but improving." Emma sat on the edge of the bed, taking her mother's hand. The skin felt paper-thin, veins prominent beneath the surface. "That's good news." Catherine studied her daughter's face. "Something's bothering you. What happened?" Emma had never been able to hide anything from her mother. Taking a deep breath, she reached into her pocket and withdrew the business card. "I met someone yesterday," she began, watching her mother's face carefully. "At the cafe." Catherine's expression remained curious, unalarmed. "Oh?" "Alexander Blackwood came in," Emma said, the words tumbling out faster than she intended. "He had your picture in his wallet, Mum. A picture from when you were young." The change in Catherine's demeanor was immediate and profound. All color drained from her face, and her hand trembled in Emma's grasp. "Alex was—" "There," she whispered, her voice so faint Emma had to lean closer to hear. "You never told me about him," Emma said, not accusingly, but with quiet hurt. "All these years, whenever I asked about my father, You said he wasn't in the picture. Catherine closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them again, they shimmered with unshed tears. He wasn't. His father made sure of that. He told me about his father's ultimatum, Emma confirmed. But, Mom, he says he never knew about me. Is that true? A single tear traced down Catherine's cheek. I found out I was pregnant 2 weeks after he ended things. I tried to call him, but his number was disconnected. I went to his family's house, but they threatened to have me arrested for trespassing. Her voice hardened with the memory. His father told me Alex had moved on, that he was engaged to someone more suitable. Said Alex wanted nothing to do with me or any alleged child I might be carrying. Emma felt a surge of anger on her mother's behalf. So his father lied to both of you? Catherine nodded slowly. I was young and heartbroken and scared. I believed what I was told. After you were born, I tried once more to reach out, sent a letter with your picture. Her voice cracked. It came back unopened, marked Return to Sender. Another intervention from his father, probably, Emma suggested. Mum, he's here in town. Has been for years, apparently. He built his company headquarters here after finding out you lived here. Catherine looked stricken. What does he want after all this time? To help, Emma said simply. When I told him you were sick, he wanted to immediately transfer you to some fancy clinic. I stopped him, but she hesitated. He offered to cover your medical expenses. No strings attached. I don't want his money, Catherine said reflexively, an edge of pride in her voice. Emma squeezed her mother's hand. Mom, we're drowning in medical debt. I'm 16 and working instead of focusing on school. If he wants to help, why not let him? Catherine looked away, conflict evident in her expression. It's complicated, Emma. Is he my father? Emma asked directly, needing to hear the answer from her mother's lips. Catherine turned back, meeting her daughter's eyes. Yes, she whispered. You have his eyes. His determination, too. The confirmation sent a shiver through Emma. She had a father, a living, breathing father, who apparently hadn't abandoned them willingly. He wants to see you, Emma said. Should I tell him you're willing? Catherine's hands twisted the thin hospital blanket. I don't know if I'm ready for that. He kept your picture all these years, Emma said softly. That has to mean something. Before Catherine could respond, a gentle knock on the door interrupted them. Dr. Mehta entered, her expression serious, as she clutched a folder of test results. Ms. Parker, Emma, she greeted them. I have your latest results and we need to discuss next steps. Emma's heart sank at the doctor's tone. What's wrong? Dr. Mehta sat in the chair opposite Emma. The experimental treatment isn't progressing as we'd hoped. The cancer is showing resistance to the protocol. Catherine closed her eyes briefly, absorbing the blow. What options do we have left? There's a newer treatment available, Dr. Mehta explained. A targeted immunotherapy that's showing promising results for cases like yours. But, she hesitated. But it's not covered by insurance, Catherine finished for her, a hint of resignation in her voice. Unfortunately, no. It's still in clinical trials at specialized centers. The nearest one is the Mayfield Clinic. Emma's head snapped up. The Mayfield Clinic? That's where Alexander wanted to send you. Dr. Mehta looked between them, confused. Alexander? My father, Emma said, the word strange on her tongue. Alexander Blackwood. Recognition dawned on Dr. Mehta's face. Blackwood? As in Blackwood Enterprises? They're one of the major funders of the Mayfield Research Program. The coincidence seemed too perfect to ignore. Emma pulled out the business card, holding it up for her mother to see. This might be more than just a random offer, Mom. This might be the only chance. Catherine stared at the card, conflict evident in her eyes. Years of independence warred with maternal instinct, the desperate need to survive for her daughter's sake. Call him, she finally said, her voice barely audible. Emma stepped into the hallway, heart pounding as she dialed the number. Alexander answered on the first ring, as though he'd been waiting by the phone. Emma, is everything all right? We need your help, she said simply. Mom's treatment isn't working, and they're recommending the Mayfield Clinic. Can you still... I'll make the arrangements immediately, he replied without hesitation. Is she willing to see me? Emma hesitated, then decided honesty was best. She's scared and proud and hurt, but yes, I think she is. I'll be there in 20 minutes, Alexander said, and Emma could hear the sound of car keys in the background. As she ended the call and returned to her mother's room, Emma felt caught between hope and fear. Everything was happening so quickly. Yesterday she'd been a girl with no father and a dying mother. Today she had found half her missing history, but her mother's condition had worsened. "He's coming," she told Catherine, watching as her mother's hand instinctively went to her thinning hair, a gesture so humanly vulnerable it made Emma's throat tight with emotion. "After 17 years, Catherine murmured, "Alexander Blackwood is walking back into our lives. I never thought this day would come." "Are you angry?" Emma asked, settling beside her again. Catherine's eyes held a complexity of emotions. "I was, for many years, but life is too short for anger, Emma. I learned that when I got sick." She managed a small smile. "Besides, how can I regret anything that gave me you?" They sat in silence after that, waiting for the arrival of the man whose absence had shaped their lives. Outside the window, the autumn rain had finally stopped, and weak sunlight broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the hospital floor. A new chapter was beginning, whether they were ready or not. 23 minutes after Emma's call, a soft knock on the hospital room door made both women freeze. Emma glanced at her mother, noting the nervous way Catherine smoothed her blanket and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "Come in," Emma called, standing protectively near her mother's bed. The door opened, and Alexander Blackwood stepped inside. He carried no flowers, no gifts, just himself, looking remarkably vulnerable for a man who commanded a business empire. His eyes moved first to Catherine, and Emma witnessed a transformation in his expression, from tension to something so raw and unguarded it almost hurt to watch. "Catherine," he said softly, her name sounding like both a prayer and an apology on his lips. "Hello, Alex," Catherine replied, her voice steadier than Emma had expected. "It's been a long time." Alexander took a tentative step forward. 17 years, 4 months, and 12 days, he said. "Not that I've been counting." A ghost of a smile flitted across Catherine's face. "Still precise about everything, I see." "Some things don't change," he acknowledged, then his gaze shifted to Emma, though apparently some rather significant things happened without my knowledge. An uncomfortable silence filled the room until Catherine sighed. "You should sit down, Alex. This will be a long conversation." He moved to the chair beside the bed, his movements oddly hesitant for a man accustomed to commanding boardrooms. "I've already spoken with Dr. Mehta," he said. "Everything's arranged for your transfer to Mayfield tomorrow morning. They're expecting you, and their team is reviewing your case now." Catherine frowned. That was presumptuous. "Maybe," Alexander conceded, "but time is precious, and from what Emma told me about your condition—" He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. "Thank you," Catherine said after a moment, the words clearly difficult for her. "For helping, even though you don't owe us anything." Alexander's expression hardened. "Don't I? 17 years, Catherine. 17 years. I didn't know I had a daughter." He looked at Emma, pain evident in his eyes. 17 birthdays I missed. First steps, first words, first day of school, everything. "Your father," Catherine began. "My father was a manipulative tyrant," Alexander interrupted, his voice tight with anger not directed at her. "But I should have tried harder to find you. I should have known he would interfere when I sent that private investigator to locate you 10 years ago." Catherine looked genuinely surprised. "You tried to find me?" 3 times, Alexander admitted. Each time, the investigator returned claiming you had explicitly requested no contact. After the 3rd attempt, I respected what I thought were your wishes, but I couldn't stay away completely. That's why I moved the company here, just to be in the same town, even if I never approached you. Emma watched her mother absorb this information, years of misunderstandings and deliberate sabotage becoming clear. "He died still believing he'd done the right thing," Alexander continued, bitterness edging his voice. "Protecting the precious Blackwood legacy from an unsuitable match. If he hadn't suffered that stroke 5 years ago, I wonder if we'd be here now." Catherine's face softened slightly. "I'm sorry about your father, despite everything." Alexander shook his head in amazement. "That's who you are, Catherine. Compassionate to a fault, even toward those who hurt you." He glanced at Emma. "You got that from your mother, I imagine." "She's stubborn like you, though," Catherine offered, a hint of warmth creeping into her voice. "And she has your analytical mind. Top of her class in mathematics." Pride bloomed across Alexander's face as he looked at Emma. "Really?" Emma felt a strange flutter in her chest at his evident delight in this small piece of information about her. "It's not a big deal," she said, embarrassed. "It is to me," he replied simply. The conversation continued, cautious at first, then gradually warming as Catherine shared snippets of Emma's childhood, and Alexander spoke of his life, the success that had felt hollow, the marriages that had failed because, as he reluctantly admitted, no one had ever measured up to his memory of Catherine. As morning stretched into afternoon, Emma noticed her mother's increasing fatigue. "Mom needs to rest," she said, interrupting Alexander's story about a business trip to Tokyo. "Of course," he agreed immediately, standing. "I should go anyway. There are arrangements to finalize for tomorrow." He hesitated, then added, "May I come back this evening?" Catherine nodded, a small but significant gesture of permission. As Alexander turned to leave, Emma impulsively decided to walk him out. In the hallway, away from her mother's watchful eyes, Emma studied the man who was her father. "You still love her," she stated. Not a question, but an observation. Alexander didn't deny it. "I never stopped." "And what about me?" Emma asked, voicing the fear that had lingered since yesterday. "Where do I fit in this reunion story?" Alexander's expression grew serious. "Emma, finding out about you has been the greatest gift and the greatest regret of my life. Joy that you exist. Regret for all the time lost." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I'm not expecting to instantly become Dad. I haven't earned that. But I would like the chance to know you, to be part of your life in whatever way you're comfortable with." His honesty disarmed her. "I'd like that too," she admitted. "But Mom comes first. Her getting better. That's what matters most." "Absolutely," he agreed. "Catherine's health is the priority." He reached into his jacket and withdrew an envelope. "This is for you. It's not some grand gesture to buy your affection, just practical support." Emma opened it to find a bank card and documents establishing a trust in her name. "What's this?" "Financial security," Alexander explained, "so you can quit that cafe job and focus on school and being with your mother. The trust becomes fully yours at 21, but there's an allowance available immediately for any expenses." Emma's first instinct was to refuse, but practicality won out. "Thank you," she said sincerely. "It will make a difference." Alexander nodded, seemingly relieved she had accepted. "I'll see you tonight, then." "Yes," Emma confirmed. "And thank you for not giving up, even when you thought Mom didn't want to see you." A sad smile touched his lips. "Some people are worth waiting for, no matter how long it takes." 6 months later, Emma stood between her parents on the hospital's rooftop garden, watching as Catherine took her first unassisted steps since completing her treatment. The advanced immunotherapy at Mayfield had worked better than anyone dared hope, pushing her cancer into remission. "Careful," Alexander cautioned, his arm ready to support Catherine if needed, but she waved him off. "I've got this," she insisted, determination in every step. Emma watched them with a full heart. The road hadn't been easy. There had been difficult conversations, tears, and painful reckonings with the past. Trust was being rebuilt slowly, day by day. Alexander had moved into a condo near the hospital during Catherine's treatment, visiting daily, eventually breaking through her carefully constructed defenses. When Catherine stumbled slightly, both Emma and Alexander moved to catch her, their protective instincts perfectly synchronized. Catherine laughed, a sound that had become wonderfully common again. "My two overprotective Blackwoods," she teased. Emma smiled at the casual use of the name. She hadn't officially changed her surname, but she had grown comfortable with the connection to her father and the new branch of her family tree. "We have reason to be protective," Alexander said, his arm settling around Catherine's waist as she allowed him to support her back to the bench. As they sat together, Catherine between them, Emma marveled at how life could change so dramatically. A chance encounter, a photograph kept for 17 years, a billionaire's coffee run that altered 3 lives forever. "What are you thinking about?" Catherine asked, noting her daughter's contemplative expression. "About fate," Emma replied. "About how sometimes the worst circumstances can lead to something beautiful." Alexander reached across to squeeze Emma's hand. "Wise beyond your years," he said proudly. "Though I'd prefer you not share such insights with the board when you start your internship this summer." Emma laughed. "No promises. Someone needs to keep you humble, Dad." The word still felt new on her tongue, but increasingly right. Alexander's expression softened every time she used it, as it did now. Catherine leaned her head against Alexander's shoulder, their reconciliation perhaps the most unexpected miracle of all. Second chances were rare, but they had seized theirs with both hands. "So," Catherine said, watching a pair of birds circle above the garden, About that conversation we started yesterday. Alexander looked nervous suddenly. You don't have to answer yet. Take all the time you need. Emma grinned, already knowing what her mother would say to Alexander's proposal. She had helped him choose the ring after all. As the spring sunshine warmed their faces and Catherine gave her answer, the one they all knew was coming, Emma thought about that rainy morning in the cafe, how one small photograph had changed everything, leading them here to this moment of perfect contentment. Some questions, it seemed, were destined to be asked. Some families, no matter how scattered by time and circumstance, were meant to find their way back to each other in the end.